Welcome, traveller, to Tales from the Woldwood, a history loosed in no particular order. I am Edvane, keeper of this archive, and I invite you now to witness our history. You are about to enter a quiet corner of Greyholt Abbey, where knowledge does not shout, and the most dangerous promises are the ones a man makes to himself for later. Greyholt Abbey was quiet. It kept its mysteries waiting to perhaps one day be unraveled. Matthis had learned to gauge his pace against it many seasons before, when he first came across the courtways and fens with wet boots and a head full of urgencies. Here, even the draughts in the corridors moved with deliberation as they wafted the smell of frost-fire winter brandy up from the deep cellars. That morning he worked beneath the refectory in the restricted stacks, where it was a little damp but had the smell of freshly bound books in the air. His task was dull, as Greyholt's more important tasks often were, cross-checking shelf marks against the most recent ledger and correcting errors that had crept in with the last intake from the outer stores. None of it would bring special praise. It was essential maintenance in a library. Matthis told himself it was what kept the monastery from becoming merely a heap of paper and parchment. He sat at a small table with ledgers stacked to one side and 3 volumes laid open before him, weighted down with smooth river stones. His work could not afford sloppiness, and though he wrote with a careful hand, his fingers were still ink-stained. The important thing was that no future reader would run the risk of a miscopied mark becoming an empty corridor, a bad key, or a false door, because they trusted what Matthis had failed to check. By mid-morning, the chill had worked into his wrists. He stood and stretched, feeling the soft ache of his joints. He grumbled about spending too many hours bent over paper and sighed. Shelves rose around him in long rows, packed so tightly that the spines of the books formed near continuous bands of leather and cloth, each labeled carefully, categories within categories, a world of marks that could be carried and stored. Brother Alwyn appeared at the end of the aisle, arms full of loose parchment and a crate balanced on his hip. He was young enough that his step still betrayed a faint hurry, though he tried to hide it. "You'll bruise yourself carrying that," Matthis said. Alwyn halted, then adjusted the crate and grinned. "I'll bruise my pride if I put it down and make 2 trips." "Pride heals poorly," Matthis said, and finally glanced at him. "What is it?" "Storm returns from the Eastern Watch, and a bundle of scraps that need sorting." Alwyn set the crate down and leaned closer to the table, his eyes skimming the neat columns of ink. "You make it look simple." "It is simple. It is not easy." Alwyn nodded, filing the distinction away, then moved on between the shelves. His footfalls faded and Greyholt's quiet reasserted itself. Matthis turned back to the shelf he had been working through, found the next entry, and reached for a volume marked with an old classification retired after a reorganization 2 abbots ago. Dust billowed, but he stifled the sneeze, logged the correction, and returned the book. To his right he noticed one thin volume, sitting slightly proud of the shelf line. Matthis had always regarded thin books as either worthless or dangerous. In his opinion, Greyholt should not waste leather on light matters unless they had a sharp point. He pressed it back in, adjusting it until the spine aligned with its neighbors. The leather was oddly smooth, worn in a way that did not match the rest. He glanced at the shelf label and then at the book's own mark. The classification was familiar enough, deep cellars, restricted, fracturing text, and realm-tied annotations, but his ledger did not list any thin volume at that position. He drew the ledger closer and ran his finger down the column. Nothing. Matthis stood still, listening to the quiet. The ledger could be wrong. That was what he was there to check after all. Still, he disliked discrepancies when they presented themselves. It showed that somebody before him had not been as assiduous in their duties as he. He drew the book free. There was no title on the spine, and the cover was plain. The page edges were cut by hand. He set it on the table beside his ledger. When his palm lifted away, the cover lifted too, no more than a thumbnail, then fell shut. He pressed it flat and held it. It stayed closed. He removed his hand. It remained closed. He stared for longer than was reasonable, looked around for potential witnesses, and Ed spoke to it. "You are making work." He opened it. The first pages were blank, though faint indentations marked where ink had once bitten and been lifted away. He flipped forward. Blank again. He ran a fingertip over the paper, feeling shallow grooves, a ghost of the former script. He closed the book and returned to his ledger. It could be a misbind. Perhaps it had been stripped and repurposed. Greyholts did not usually keep such things in restricted stacks, but its holds kept oddities everywhere, so he noted the discrepancy and moved on. An hour later, he returned to cross-check the next entries. The thin book was proud again, eased forward of its neighbors. Matthis immediately pressed it in, irritated by the impertinence. But this time it resisted somehow. The book refused to settle the way the other books did. He released it and watched. The spine crept forward again and stopped. He took it back to the table and stood over it. "No," he said, looking around, aware of the absurdity. The pages were not filled. Most were blank, truly blank this time, without the faint scars of erased ink, yet a handful carried writing. 6 of them in all, spread throughout the book, but the script was unlike anything he had seen before. At first glance it looked childish, with short strokes, characters that seemed to repeat, but with slight variations. There were no margins, dates or headings, and the lines did not sit evenly. Some crowded together while others wandered, drifting upward or down. This was not cipher. Greyholt had shelves of ciphers, some playful and some lethal. This was not that, nor was it shorthand, or the compressed notation of the realm-tied scholars. The characters repeated, but never in the same order. A curved mark returned again and again, paired sometimes with a straight stroke, sometimes with a hook, sometimes alone. He turned the page and found the same shapes, altered just enough to suggest intention. "I don't know you," he said. The book did not answer, of course, though the writing was answer enough, because it refused to settle into sense. Matthis flipped back to the first written page and read more carefully, searching for meaning or structure. The characters did not sit like words, they sat like gestures, and he had the sudden impression that if he were able to speak them aloud, they might do something. He closed the book halfway, then opened it again, testing whether the pages would change as they had before, but they did not. The 6 pages remained as they were, the rest stayed blank. Whatever this was, it existed on its own terms, incomplete and unapologetic. He turned the book sideways and inspected the binding. It was older than it had first appeared. The leather was clearly reworked and the stitching repaired multiple times. This was not a recent experiment left unfinished, he decided. It was a survivor. A memory stirred of a lecture given years ago by an elderly steward who had spoken, with deliberate vagueness, about the first language. The lecture had ended as such things often did, with caution. Matthis had not thought of it in years. He returned to the book and read again, slower still. On the 3rd page, among the drifting characters, he noticed a pattern. 3 marks clustered together and repeated twice, with a space between them. He compared it to the 5th page. There it was again, altered slightly, carrying a different emphasis. He realized then that this was not a record or commentary. It was not even instruction, but at least not in the way Greyholt understood instruction. It was closer to a vocabulary without grammar, or grammar without vocabulary, pieces of something that assumed a shared understanding that no longer existed. If this was what he thought it might be, then it was dangerous because it predated explanation. It belonged to a time when naming and doing were not separate acts. Matthis closed the book carefully, and Brother Alwyn's earlier curiosity returned to him. He imagined the young steward standing where he stood now, and what a few half-understood marks might do in such a mind. He slid the book beneath a ledger and sat down. He waited a while, and when he lifted the ledger again and reopened the book, nothing had changed. The 6 pages remained, the rest were blank. Matthis gathered the book up and returned it to the shelf where he had found it. He pushed it in until it aligned, then withdrew his hand. This time it did not creep forward again. It sat there, modest, unremarkable, and easy to overlook. He stood there and committed the shelf's position to memory, the classification above it and a small chip in the shelf just to the left. He did not alter the ledger or add a mark. To catalogue it now would be to invite questions he wanted no other to answer. Later, he promised. He returned to his table and finished his work. When Brother Alwyn passed again, Matthis answered him as he always did. When the bells rang for supper, he gathered his ledgers and extinguished the lamp. As he walked back into Greyholt Abbey, its quiet closed in around him. The book remained where it was, holding its few pages of something no longer understood. Matthis told himself he would return to it when he had earned the right, when he had the time and the discipline to approach it properly. He never did, and one day, when returning was difficult, he remembered it, far, far away. Not every truth is meant to be grasped when first encountered. Some knowledge does its greatest harm by being touched too soon, leaving behind a lifetime of questions shaped by a forgotten promise.